Welcome to Pirate Living Podcast. We're your hosts, Karan and Kristen. On this podcast, we are highlighting ordinary people living extraordinary lives. These are pirates who take small, bold actions daily to create social change. Pirate life is all about rebelling and breaking the rules for good. Creating lasting social change starts by first breaking our inner rules. After all, the hardest rules to break are your own. The pirates we highlight have dedicated themselves to creating good trouble.
Today we are talking with Iona Lawrence. Iona works with people and groups to create strategies to break through tough issues. In recent years, Iona has focused her attention on issues around loneliness and social isolation, an issue that many adults face, and she is building communities by helping individuals find a sense of belonging and connection. And we're thrilled to be talking with you today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I want to double check. Did I pronounce your first name correctly as I ask after I push play?
It's a Scottish island. So me and my 4 siblings are all named after Scottish islands.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I'm Scottish.
So yeah, we're thrilled to have you today. And you worked with many pirate organizations and built changing collaborations. So we'd love for you to take us on a journey. Tell us about how your pirate adventures began.
I love the playfulness of the pirate language. Every time I spend time with people who think they're a pirate and talk about piracy, it's fun. So what's the interesting way to tell you a bit about myself? I suppose starting at the beginning. I am the eldest of 5 kids from a rural bit of East England called Suffolk. And that upbringing was rich and loving and full of strong connections. And my parents are both kind of manual laborers, I suppose, in some way. My dad is a joiner and my mum ran a sort of bed and breakfast or a kind of lodgings from our house. And so dinner tables were always full and they're very kind of community-minded people. So I grew up with a really strong sense of the power of relationships, not just in the home, but also outside of the home. And that was sort of backdropped with the fact that I was also then at school quite badly bullied. Every school I went to, I was really I don't know what it was about me, but I was easy to pick on. So I had these sort of 2 sides to my life. One side that was very rich and loving. When I say rich, I mean strong, rich connections and loving. And then these kind of other periods of kind of isolation and loneliness and quite a lot of pain. And so once I got to university, I went to university in Scotland because I've got lots of Scottish family. And then I came out of university, and actually going back a bit, I was a kid of the 90s. So I don't know where you guys were in the 90s, but here in the UK, if you were a kid, you grew up drinking the Kool-Aid of history had ended, the finish line had been reached. It was, if you wanted to change things and be useful in the world, you did it abroad. So all of those big stories we consumed were things, I don't know how much this would have crossed your path, but on the other side of the pond, but things like Make Poverty History and the Jubilee Debt Campaign. The big stories of change that I consumed as a child were sort of international ones. So when I came out of university, the obvious thing as someone who wanted to be useful in the world was to focus my interests on kind of international work. And I suppose the following 15 years have been about kind of interrogating that and probably stepping back a bit from some of the assumptions that underpinned that. But I started work in kind of the international development space and worked as a coalition kind of campaigner. So how do you bring different organizations together around stuff that matters, whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN or around G8 frameworks and that sort of thing. And then coming through that, I sort of became increasingly disillusioned about some of the machinery of international development and how some of the big kind of triumphant successes and wins to kind of campaigns that I was a part of running never really felt like they were changing very much in real terms, although we can look at the data and data will tell you that inequality, the poverty, absolute poverty is reducing, but inequality is increasing. And it was a lot of focus on like, how do you get media headlines and not how do you drive what felt like to me real change. So I sort of stepped away from some of that work and found myself following a few friends to the refugee camps in northern France. So where there were collections of people in the kind of 2015, 2016 period. So the relatively early stages of the Syrian crisis. And there were, I set up and ran a legal project to help unaccompanied child refugees access safe and legal routes to asylum, either in the UK or around Europe where their families were. And I suppose if I'd gone from working in air-conditioned offices in London on processes that seemed quite remote and feeling not clear on the impact that I was able to have, I was lucky to then find myself in a very different experience, working shoulder to shoulder with people who'd experienced extraordinary trauma and had taken their future into their own hands and left home. And it was through community organising, actually, that we were able to support them to engage in legal processes and sort of for a period of time were able to rewrite certain bits of migration policy. But there was this period of time where, at least over here in Europe, there was wider public and political support for refugees in that period, in the early stages of the Syrian crisis. And by 2016, that had fallen away, and you could feel that a few of the camps were taken down very sort of brutally, I suppose, by the French authorities, and our work became impossible. So the lawyers continued, and I had to come home. And then, I mean, you can sense a sort of a pattern here, which is that I really enjoy sort of throwing open kind of time and space for opportunities. And it was from that point I came back to the UK and was thinking about becoming a lawyer, because I was like, law does so much stuff. We'd supported hundreds of young Syrian kids to access safety through the law. And it's probably in hindsight quite lucky I didn't become a lawyer, because my attention to detail is not brilliant. And from there was working out what I was going to do next when a friend of mine, Joe Cox, was killed. And so I think probably in the long trajectory of my life, it will probably be one of the most sort of defining moments, and not just for my life, most especially for her friends and family, but also for the country and for people who didn't know her. And I just, for the sake of your listeners, because I imagine you have quite a global audience, Jo Cox was a member of parliament here in the UK. She'd only been an MP for about a year. She was relatively young, in her early 40s, and in the lead up to the Brexit referendum, it was a week or two before the Brexit referendum went to the polls or whatever, before we voted on that. A member of her constituency kind of assassinated her in her constituency in Yorkshire. And it was then later, once that man was being tried in court, that he was found to be of sort of sane mind. He wasn't sort of having psychosis, he wasn't unwell. It was a kind of politically motivated murder, and he had seen this as I suppose what he saw to be a kind of rational thing to do with his political opinions. And Jo and I were friends, having worked together previously. And I'd sort of spent, she loved camping, and I loved camping as well. So we spent some time camping together, and I got to know her young kids, who were 2 and 4 at the time. And so, because I was without a job at this stage, I sort of offered my support to her family and helped them do things like probate law and organise funerals. And one thing led to another, and her friends had raised £2 million in a crowdfunder. And so I went on to work with them to set up a foundation in her memory. And there were lots of things we could talk about that we've done in her memory, but I suppose there are lots of things that I hold dear about the example she set that inform lots of the work I do today, and not just the work I do, but like who I am in the world and how I want to be a pirate, to use that language. I suppose she's probably most sort of renowned for having said in her maiden speech in Parliament here in the UK that what surprised her about her very diverse constituency in Northern England, where there are lots of different communities living, is that she was surprised time and again how much people have in common and how much more those things in common define us than the things that divide us or that separate us. And so that more in common kind of legacy is really what sort of informed a lot of the work we did in her memory, and also a lot of the work I now do, both attached to her foundation and also more broadly. So yeah, from there we set up an organization and we ran networks and partnerships to kind of turbocharge her legacy. We campaigned to appoint a minister for loneliness to try and turbocharge kind of social connectedness and a kind of an understanding that loneliness isn't just an older person issue, but a wider issue. And we can come back to more on that. But also we did lots of different things. But one of the amazing things about that job was I and my small team sat behind the scenes and we just worked with her friends and her family and the public to pick up where she left off. And so it was this unbelievable, like, I love being a pirate that's behind the scenes that people don't really know about. And like, that was an unbelievable job of recognizing there was a huge opportunity to build something meaningful out of this trauma. And then also knowing that you had thousands of people wanting to help. It was just about giving them the right permission, which is obviously a really important kind of pirate theme in order to pick up where Jo had left off. Fast forward a few years, I'm now freelance, and I suppose I focus my work and my energy around two rebellions or two areas I'm particularly interested in, although I'm pretty much interested in everyone's rebellions, like literally anything. Like, spend a lot of my time not being paid just to like help people plot things and like, make trouble. And one is around this theme of loneliness and social connection, the fact that, like I believe as Jo did, that we've lost something in our modern age, and about like what meaningful relationship looks like and what that's the source of that power can offer us. And so whether it's working with small charities or large businesses, I basically do anything to support people to put relationships and social connections in a meaningful way first. So that might be helping them raise money to fund work on loneliness and social isolation, or intergenerational social contact, or lots of different things. Or it might be coming up with new campaigns or policy ideas in order to make that possible. And the second area that I'm super interested in is this, I think it's quite a like nascent area in the UK at least, but the idea that particularly in non-profits, which is a lot of where I've done my work, as is probably obvious, the idea that we're really good at starting things, you know, growth for growth's sake is like so much a part of not just how we work, but who we are and what modern society, especially in the West, I suppose, has come to value. And when that comes to our nonprofits and our charities here in the UK, at least, that can be a source of real change and drive and like an impact. It can also lead to some really bad patterns in civil society, some places where resources are hoarded, power isn't shared, and where bad ideas are just replicated and toxic dynamics are replicated. So one of the kind of other themes that I work on alongside loneliness and social connection is basically supporting charities and nonprofits to know when it's time to call something a day. And that might be the moment that a founder or chief exec decides they want to step down and how they plan for that to be good and effective and smooth and impactful. Or it might be when a philanthropist decides they want to remove themselves from funding something. It might be the closure and merger of a whole organization. But I'm obsessed with what happens if we pay as much attention and put as much money into the endings of something as we do the beginnings. Because if we did that, we'd create the conditions for like stronger, more regenerative cycles of change. And that is very countercultural. So yeah, that's a long, rambly journey through some of what has brought me to having this conversation with you.
There's so much in there. And I'm just gonna say Karan is here with her camera off. I thought we had lost her.
Yeah. You did lose me for a few minutes, but I'm back, and I figured camera off is probably the safest. So there's a lot, and since I seem to be connected at the moment, I'll talk first. There's a lot of what you said there. One of the things I want to talk about is like the idea of loneliness and social connection. And I've actually had this conversation a number of times recently. Like 95% of my clients are females. And the conversations around the fact that while women tend to have more social connection and more friends, they often talk about husbands and fathers and stuff that just don't have any friends, and their entire social circle is their wife or their partner and then their friends. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little about that, and if that's the same as what you see, and like what ways we might be able to combat that and encourage men to go make friends.
Yeah, there's so much in that, Karen, and where to begin. So if we go back to the source of my interest, I suppose, my preoccupation with loneliness, it was Jo Cox, who, as she grew up in Yorkshire, which is a constituency in the north of England, she wandered the streets with her grandpa, who was a postman. And it was only when she returned to the constituency properly, having gone and worked internationally for a decade or two, and then she came back to campaign to be the politician there, the parliamentarian there, that she recognised that a lot had changed in the time that she'd been away, or the time that she'd grown up. And that it was something about, for her, she was knocking on doors, as you do when you're canvassing to be elected. And it wasn't just the people that you might assume or expect that wanted to sort of pull her in and have a cup of tea and sit down and have a chat. You might assume that it sort of was older people for whom, I don't know about over where you are, but whenever someone's talking about loneliness or writing an article on loneliness, always pick a sort of really solitary looking bench and put a single old person on the bench and then take a photo of them from behind. And I think that's like one of the really like strong images we have of what loneliness is. And it was, as Jo was knocking on doors, and there was so many different types of people who were desperate for a conversation, not just about politics, but about their lives. She recognized that there was something that had shifted in the social fabric of her community in the time that she had grown up and gone away and moved back again. And so when she arrived in Westminster in London as an elected politician, and spoke to some of her colleagues and said, is it just me, or is there a loneliness problem that stretches beyond the fact it's just older people who might be isolated and not get the social connections and community that they need? But is there a wider societal thing? Because my perception is it's people with disabilities, people who are carers, younger people with mental health challenges, people who are transitioning in and out of parenthood or retirement. She was like, there seems to be so many people for whom the social connections they have aren't the connections they need or want at a particular moment in time. And it was lots of her colleagues were like, yes, I agree. And so she set up a commission on loneliness to basically try and inquire into and understand what is being done to address this kind of social connection deficit. And it was just as she was launching that she was killed. And so a couple of her colleagues, one on the Conservative and one on the Labour side of Westminster, came together to run what then became the Jo Cox Loneliness Commission. And we ran a year's worth of sort of research and public mobilization to basically understand what it is that people perceive loneliness to be, and who is experiencing it the most. And I think now we're sitting this side of the kind of COVID and lockdowns, it's much more obvious, I think, to most people that loneliness isn't something that just older people experience. It cuts through and cuts across lots of different like determinants of like health, and that might be your socioeconomic position. It might be the workplace you work in, and like defined by what kind of work you do. It might be your race. It might be your faith and ethnicity. And it's actually in America that a lot more of this work, I suppose, analysis has been going on for a really long time. So Robert Putnam, the man that wrote Bowling Alone, which is the big sort of seminal late 20th century book on the kind of ebbing away of our connections and our associations. So fewer people going to church, fewer people belonging to workplaces for long periods of time, fewer family meals, fewer community associations, was kind of impacting lots of the different ways, like had lots of impact basically on how happy we are with ourselves, whether we feel like we belong to a community, whether we feel safe and our needs are met. But increasingly, in the 20th century, there's an academic called Julianne Holt-Lundschaft who's done this kind of seminal research that basically says loneliness isn't just bad for our kind of sense of self and our sense of pride. It's actually really bad for our health, and being chronically lonely for an extended period of time has the same impact on your body, because you're basically flooded with toxins, as 15 cigarettes a day does. So I think by the time we get to where we are now, Karen, this side of the COVID lockdowns and all of the kind of attention that there was put on that kind of universal experience. So whoever you were, you might be in a house full of too many people and feel isolated because a lockdown was a very intense period and you didn't have the time you needed for yourself. Or like me, you were entirely on your own and you didn't touch another human for 2.5 months and you went a bit like crazy because of that. We know that loneliness is a universal experience, and it touches lots of us at lots of different phases in our lives, and that it, as so many of these things does, follows lines of inequality. So the more marginalized you are in society, the more cut out and cut off you are likely to feel from society's gains, and therefore in so many ways like loneliness as a subjective experience also follows just like patterns of inequality. And so it's easy in this kind of context to say, well, the thing we need to do is we need to go backwards. We need to go back to a time where families were structured in a way that provided maybe stronger, more meaningful connections. Or we need to go back to a time where more of us went to church or belonged or had time to belong to community and groups. I'm not of that ilk. Like, I don't believe that going backwards is the way to do it, not least because some of those institutions that did bring us together, whilst they served some of our needs, they also had like great problems. And so what we have now is the ability, and lots of people are already doing, and I'm sure lots of the pirates you've spoken to, as much as yourselves as individuals, are part of recreating the kind of institutions and the ways in which we can build and strengthen connections in a way that is commensurate to the modern day. So obviously one of the big challenges to meaningful connection and a sense of belonging, which in my opinion is one of the things that is the sort of antithesis to loneliness. If loneliness is all about feeling cut out and cut off, belonging, if you experience belonging, it means you've probably experienced the sort of relationships and connections either to others or to a place that makes you feel like you are kind of safe and secure, and you're not at risk of loneliness. And so, yeah, I've lost my train of thought slightly, but yeah, I'm sort of interested in, and will work with lots of different people, both as a professional, but also as a human outside of work life, anyone who's building new ways to connect. And so, Karen, thinking about sport, for example, and the work that you do, there's obviously a huge role that sport has and exercise has always played in bringing people together. And in the UK at least, there's something called Park Run, and I don't know if it's over on your side, but of the pond, but Park Run is a nationwide kind of weekly 5K run that happens in parks and around communities, and it's all volunteer run. And the idea there is it's partly about getting people out and getting people exercising. It's also about getting them connected. And one of the things I love most about the way they measure their impact is that over the years that they've been running, the average time it takes to complete a park run has got longer, meaning that the people that they've attracted to join that and who come time and again for the community aren't just coming for the exercise, they're coming for lots of the other benefits. Because if it was for elite athletes only, the time would be getting shorter, not longer. So yeah, I'm interested in what you guys see. If your experience of loneliness and your perception of loneliness in your places or communities is similar, but also we could probably talk for the next 5 hours on all of the ways in which we're inspired by new ways that people are connecting, both through COVID and post. If we're talking about post-COVID, I'm not sure quite I feel comfortable with talking about that yet. What are the ways in which you personally, or you see people around you, like finding new ways to build connections and strengthen kind of connections?
Yeah. I will start with, I love what you say about like exercise and that park run. That sounds like an amazing idea. And every time I get a new person coming to my gym, I talk about the community aspect. And I don't think it's until they're here for a little while when they really start to understand that, you see, I'm a morning coach, so I'm here at 5:45 a.m. and you see the same people every day. And honestly, this is where I've got like a lot of my closest friends, and people have been here 5, 10 plus years at the same gym. Now, to me, which
Mm.
seems crazy as someone that used to go from gym to gym to gym and whoever was like the cheapest. Um, so I really do believe in the whole idea of like that fitness can bring people together and create new communities. And yeah, there are different ways of connecting now. And we talked about this before we hit record, the fact that Kristen and I have never met in person.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
using technology when we were doing our Enlifted course together, and like, hey, want to hang out on Zoom, because first of all, it was the pandemic and that's how everyone was hanging out. And
Mhm.
that's the only way we actually could hang out and becoming friends and connecting that way. So it's a lot easier through, time, space, distance now to connect to people on, a deep level, even if you're not face to face. So I do think technology, and specifically because of the pandemic, like I never heard of Zoom before the pandemic,
No.
has actually changed the way that we can form these connections. And I don't think there's been a day since that I haven't at least had a text from Kristen, which is, we joke and I'm like, I love you the most out of all the people I've never met. Right? So yeah, there is a lot. And yeah, I'll pass it over to Kristen while I put myself back on mute here. I think I got a whole thing out before.
Yeah,
Yeah, we got you on.
we got you.
Yeah.
Yeah. That like the Zoom part really did help for good, yeah, like I think two good years of that was a way of really connecting with people. Um and I've noticed for myself, like I'm in a post Zoom era. Like I love the podcast and getting to chat with people from all over the world through the podcast. But beyond that, I'm like, I don't want to get on Zoom. I want to meet people in real, like closer to me. So it's been there's also been a shift for me where I've realized like I didn't have a lot of people close around me that I was really tight with, felt community with. And so for me, I have recently met some friends out here in Portland that they do pizza nights once a week. And so I've gotten to like, that's been a highlight of my week, to get together with people, have dinner together, laugh, joke. But I've realized too, through meeting people locally, I've started to get introduced to parents for watching their kids. And a lot of these parents feel so alone. And they're feeling overwhelmed because they are like, I'm doing this alone. I could use all the help that I can get. And so when I do start talking to them about doing care for their kids, for me personally, I need it to be smaller amounts of time just so that all of us are getting the most benefit out of it. Because if it's like 6 hours a day regularly, that's not going to work. I'm not going to be at my best. So yeah, it's like they want more time because they're like, I need the time. I can take all the help I can get. And I've had to be like, I will do this much time. I need to put boundaries around myself and what I can do. And there's part of me that's like, oh, I can give it. I can keep giving to you. And then I remind myself, no, because then I'm going to eventually not have what I have right now. I won't have the energy. I won't have the excitement. But yeah, there's this loneliness within parent to parent as well. Even within like joining other parent groups, they still feel alone because I think what they're doing is talking about how they feel like they're doing everything on their own. So yeah, community is something that I think a lot of people seek, but they're not sure how how to get it. And maybe the depths of their relationships aren't as deep as what they'd like for them to be. Or I'm even curious too, if people don't realize that they do have a connection. And if that's part of the loneliness, like they don't realize, hey, I have been talking with people and I have been making connections, or if it's the level of connection that they're making.
Yeah, there's so much in what you just said. And the thing about loneliness is it's entirely subjective. So if we wanted to, if my rebellion or our shared interest were obesity, you would be able to say, although there are lots of things that drive obesity patterns, you are able to ask yourself, are rates of obesity going down? And that can be, the challenge with something like loneliness is it's self-diagnosed, right? Like you are in control of saying, instead of a set of weighing scales say, you are in charge of saying whether or not you feel more lonely today, more connected today than you did yesterday, or last week, or last year. And therefore, each of us will have a different threshold for what it is that we think we need in order to be healthy and happy. And I'm in my partner is he and I are in a long distance relationship very happily, and I think we probably sit at opposite ends of the spectrum for like social contact need. I could happily be in human company basically 90% of my time. I have like this unquenchable thirst for like other humans. I absolutely love other just even like brand new humans on the bus who want to have a chat with me, like wonderful people like you from the internet who I connect with. And he is just the other end. He is extremely introverted and he's actually very good with humans, but you wouldn't necessarily to meet him know, but he has this point at beyond which he just cannot, he needs to go and be on his own for quite an extended period of time. And it took us a really long time to work that out, because we sort of all assume that everyone is sort of like us and that everyone else can cope with whatever it is we want to cope with. And I'm being a bit sarcastic here, but each of us are different, and therefore to design universal ways for people to find meaningful connection and meet their social contact needs is impossible, because we are all unique and need different things and will find different things meaningful. But we do know a few things about what the source of like good contact is. And so like there's to think about the theory, I'm sure you've come across this before, but social contact theory is about sort of helps describe what it is that can be the conditions in which meaningful connection arise when two people or a group of people come together and they do something that has some level of synchronicity. Dancing, sport, singing, like those sorts of things, like not universally, but for lots of people do bolster this sense of like, a connection is meaningful if you've done something that is like has some synchronicity. If you meet as equals as much as possible, like what are the conditions in which you can create the opportunity for people to meet and like exchange rather than to like feel like someone is doing something to the other. So that's where people coming home from hospital after an extended stay need to move out of a kind of service context where something's being done to them and much more into a kind of reciprocal relationship context if they're to survive and thrive after probably quite a traumatic period of time in hospital. And that's where befriending networks come in. And there are some good befriending networks. There are also some like less effective ones, but the better ones always consistently create the sense that even if someone is as effectively the befriender, everything within their power and everyone's power is done to make those people feel genuinely like they want to just spend their time together. And so yeah, what can be done to like help people meet as equals, and what can you get to do? Like I think a lot about how loneliness impacts our politics, and that rates of loneliness are skyrocketing, and where like segregation in communities between people who have different political beliefs or social value sets are kind of being pulled apart and not interacting anymore. And then increasingly we have these very fractious democratic moments where whether it's an election or a referendum, it feels like you are like miles apart from like a whole half of the other country, and either you totally agree with everyone around you or you don't. And a lot of that, I think, is underpinned by, it's not necessarily only, but underpinned by loneliness, because it's so easy for us to assume that we don't understand people who have different views to us if we don't actually have any personal relationships with people who might feel differently to us. And so that's one of the challenges we have about this increasingly atomized society. I would attribute a lot of that, not completely, but a lot of it, to capitalism and the way in which it's incentivized certain types of relationships to flourish in our communities and our societies and our workplaces and our economy. But the challenge we now have is what can be done to meet our need for human connection in ways that both bond us with people who we like feel safe with and we feel similar to. We know for millennia we've gathered together in tribes and groups because that makes us feel safe, and so we do need to meet our need to spend time with people who are like us. That might be in culture, or it might be in faith, it might be in social values or belief sets. But then we also need bridging relationships. We need relationships that connect us in some way meaningfully to people who are in some way different to us, because in vibrant multicultural societies, I believe that we need both of those kind of bridging and bonding relationships, not just to meet our loneliness crisis and the health impacts of feeling very isolated and lonely, but also in order for our like democracies to function and for our communities to be like thriving places to live, where we can recognize that we're here to support one another. But if we come back to the very basics of it, it really, and the kind of pirate methodology, which is like, you can have these big ideas, but like, what does it look like now? What does it look like tomorrow? Like, what can we start doing? It is about just like in my opinion, it's about radical relationships. It's about like, who are the people that you haven't reached out to? Where are the relationships you could deepen that could service your needs as much as those needs? And who are the people you don't yet know that you have relatively little to lose by reaching out to? And what could you do together that could be both enjoyable and fun and meaningful, and could just be a one-off interaction, or it could be an extended relationship? But I think every time any of us choose to meaningfully connect rather than transact in a fairly superficial, highly commercialized way, where we're basically just like automatons of like capitalist transaction. Every time we choose to be vulnerable, we choose to connect, we choose to reach out to someone who, like, on the surface of things we have like no common value with, we are building piece by piece a radical relational fabric to our societies. And I suppose everything you just described, Kristen, points to like the ability, like, that it's still possible, even when it feels like it's not possible, it's still possible.
Mm-hmm. I have a question too, as somebody who you said you could talk to anybody just on a bus ride. And so my husband and I go to climbing gym, which is a way of having people around. And sometimes I don't want the people around, but sometimes I'm like, I'm in a social mood right now. I'd love to chat with somebody. And we get very short conversations. Like sometimes they even look at me like, why are you talking to me? Because I'll like break out. I'll give some little joke, or I'll try to say something friendly to somebody that like looked over or even said something first. But yeah, like, and it could just be that they're in a mood where they're like, I don't want to talk to people today. But yeah, how do you bridge that gap with people to get them to the point where you can get that conversation going? Because I've been at this gym for a year also, and I'm like, I don't know who these people are. I see some of them all the time. But yeah, I'm curious from the point of somebody that can get a conversation going for a long time. Like, what are your tips? What are your tricks?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's really hard because when something comes easily to you, it's like, well, it's just easy. In the same way that I can't do maths, right? I can't do maths. So whenever someone was like, but it's so easy in a maths class, I was like, it's not easy. My paper is tear stained. So I don't know if any of this will be useful or interesting, but I mean, you like, as far as I can understand, you've taken, like, the first step is always to try and do something where you might meet people. So like it takes a very certain sort of person to just like walk up to someone and start making conversation. But once you've got something to do, whether it's climbing or knitting or whatever, we know that humans feel much more safe and secure in order to like reach out and make conversation. So one example of an organization in the UK here that does that beautifully is an organization called the Cares Family, and they were set up about 10 years ago, and they bring together sort of young professionals and older people in big cities where things are changing really fast. Gentrification is moving cities around really fast, and it's very easy to live next door to people who you have like nothing, like no reason to interact with, you have no excuse to connect with. And so they organize pub quizzes and dance classes and digital tech workshops and like you name it, basically anything that just provides the excuse to connect. And so, yeah, like you've already done it by joining the gym, but like when people say to me like, you know, I do want to build and bolster my connections. It's not easy, but joining something or create or signing up to something is always the first step, because you're highly unlikely to make best friends by like making conversation with people on buses. And then that next bit, that bit that you're talking about, where you feel like you're going to something, but you're not quite, like there's no room for the conversations. And I think that's super interesting. I mean, it's a different example, but in the UK, at least, they say that in the first 2 years that you move into a new house, you're in this kind of golden period, basically, to meet people. And so you were, I can't remember what it is, but let's just say 100 times more likely to get to know your neighbours in that first 2 years than the subsequent 20. Because when we're new in a space, we're looking to build new relationships, not just with people around us, but with the space we're in and the things we're doing. And so we're much more malleable. But then once you get into something, we've all been there, you know, in those big open plan offices you might have worked in, like I've worked in, where there are people that you are in the lift with every day for 3 years and you don't know their name because they live on the other side of the office. And at some point you can't be bothered to get to know their name anymore and so finding courageous, creative, probably quite vulnerable feeling ways to connect with people once you've entered that position where you're like, well, we share space together but we're not connected, is really hard. And just using an example, I have a next door neighbor that lives downstairs, and she has a really cute toddler, but this toddler does also like to scream quite a lot, especially in the middle of the night. And you know, I live in a very small, compact block of flats. I am totally comfortable with the fact that like I can hear people, they can hear me, I can hear them. But it felt at one point like I was like, I don't know if I can go and knock on her door and be like, hey, if you ever need a hand with your kid, because it sounds quite like you've got your hands full. I was like, it's been 2 years. Like, I can't just go and introduce myself now. It looks a bit passive aggressive. And so I really agonized about this. And I spoke to loads of my friends and I was like, what do I do? And I ended up just going to the supermarket and buying a bunch of flowers and knocking on her door at 6 p.m. one evening and being like, this is really weird, but I think you're having quite an intense time. And so I bought you some flowers and want to introduce myself. And if there's anything I can ever do to help, you know where I am. And you could see in that moment, she was trying to work out whether I was like trying to, you know, if this was a way for me to like be cross with her or anything. It honestly wasn't. Like, we live in a small block of flats. I don't mind. And she, you know, that was our way in. And after 2 years of really feeling like every day I could really hear things and I didn't know if I could be useful, I did take that moment and stepped over the threshold. The risk there was that she would interpret it as something that it wasn't intended to be, but she had every right to interpret it as it. She might see it as patronizing or passive aggressive or confrontational in some way. But I took a leap of faith and was just like, if you do this in the right way, someone will hopefully, but not guaranteed, respond in a way that makes the conditions for a relationship possible. So yeah, maybe take flowers to your climbing gym. I'm not suggesting that. But like often it's like, you know, if I'm sitting on a bus and I like the book someone's reading, I'll be like, nice book. And if they just smile and they nod, then that's the end of that. But sometimes I'll be like, it is a great book. So maybe compliments the colour of someone's trainers or something. I don't know.
I mean, half of us have the same shoes, so I could just go around saying nice shoes.
Yeah, exactly. Also, some people just like to, you know, some people like to spend time together doing the same thing, but like,
Mhm.
you know, connection doesn't have to just be like talking and, you know, something that feels quite like verbal. It can also just be sharing space with people. I think a lot about rhythm, ritual, and respect. The idea that like if you do things often, and there's a rhythm to them together, that can be meaningful. The ritual is like, are you doing the same thing again and again? That is also very bonding. And the respect is like, are you respecting each other's time? And I suppose in a climbing context, that's about, are you respecting the way in which you are like using that space together? And all of those things it's not going to get you all the way to like deep, meaningful, like really close friend contact, but I think it has value for us anyway.
Yeah, I like that because yeah, not everybody that you run into, even if you're in the same place, is going to be that deep, meaningful friend. Like that's a different thing altogether, because you're looking at, do you have shared values? Do you have and it doesn't even have to be like, do you agree with each other? Because friends can disagree with each other and still get along. So sometimes those are stronger friendships too, but you're looking at a different set than if you're like, when I'm at the climbing gym and I'm just wanting to chat with somebody, like one of the managers there, who is, in my mind, she's my best friend. Every time I talk to her, I'll chat her up anytime I can catch her eye.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a different thing. Like, will we go outside of the gym and have a conversation? No, but in the gym, she's my best friend, even if we talk for only 30 seconds at a time.
Yeah, and the data's really strong on this stuff. We know that we need, on average, everyone's different, we need 5 relationships in our lives where we feel like those are the people we call when something's gone really well, when something's gone badly, when we need support. And I love approaching that question not in like, do you have people to rely on, but almost, do you have people who rely on you? Because we know that for some of us, at least, myself included, I suppose, that having people that we feel like lean on us as much as we lean on them, that's the reciprocity and the meaning. But then we also know that, and so this is all from a guy called Robert Dunbar, who's a sociologist, I think, at Oxford University. The Dunbar 5 is like that 5 close contacts, but then you can have up to 250 people who you can know the name of. You might know some of their like kids' names. You'll know like maybe you just know some basic details about them. But then we have the capacity to remember the faces and even just like soft characteristics of thousands of people. And that is like physiologically deeply like ingrained in our ability to feel safe. We need both the closest people who we call when like the chips are down or when we want to celebrate something. We also need people who can help root us in who we are and where we are and what are the stories and the legacies of history and what's our shared future and where our shared values. And so I think one of my lessons from the COVID lockdowns was the conversations I might have with the people in the supermarket, or the even just the good mornings that I might have shared as I was like hauling my sorry ass around a like park for a run at 6 a.m. Those were some of the most meaningful interactions that I could have all day. And those were the things that made me feel in those moments slightly less alone, slightly less afraid, slightly more able to cope with whatever was coming that day. And so I didn't need any of them to give me a hug, but like just knowing that there were other humans out there that I could connect with, even in a superficial way, felt reassuring. And so, yeah, thinking about that big spectrum definitely was the key.
Yeah.
That actually brings up a really good point. Hopefully you can hear me.
We can.
Okay, good. When you talk about like those 5 and that history, as like an immigrant and other immigrants, I think we lose that connection with history. So, I mean, I've been in Canada almost 17 years now, so I do have some history. But when we talk about like, you know, my youth and childhood and all of these things going back as immigrants, I think that I remember when I was here only a few years, like the loneliness was definitely a huge thing. And I actually joined a local community running group And that's how I started making friends in my local community before I started at the gym. But that.
Oh, Karen.
No. We lose her altogether. Wait, are you back?
Maybe. I don't know where I lost you. You guys both froze.
Running club before joining the gym.
Yeah. It's those, I think the historical connections that are no longer, or are only on like Facebook, because it's just pre-Zoom, that, it really does make you feel lonely to not have that history with someone. Mm-hmm. I'll shut up now, because
no, don't shut up. I think I understood. It's like, how do you maintain the stories of who you are when you've become unattached from the place or the connections that might once have been the sort of vehicles or the channels for you to like not just remember those stories but also like continue to live them, right? And that's what I think a lot about how me and my siblings, my four brothers and sisters, we get together and we just basically retell the same stories year after year, every like Christmas or birthday or whatever. And it's stupid really. And you look at in on it and you're like, why are you telling this same lame story about, so and so's first boyfriend, or that time that like, you shaved all your hair off or something? But really what those things are doing, they're rooting us in our legacy, in our heritage. They're rooting us in who we are and what matters to us, and the fact that we existed in the past, we exist in the present, and will hopefully continue to exist into the future. And when we move, or other kind of things can disrupt the way in which we connect with others, we can lose the ability to kind of continue to both relive and then generate new versions of those same stories. Which is where I think so much of the challenge of sort of migration policy comes from. I am most inspired in the UK, at least, but also around the world, by anything that is able to support people to like move places whilst carrying their heritage with them and carrying those stories with them, and being able to reroute themselves in a new place, holding those stories, but also creating new ones in that new place. But so much a part of like traditional approaches to particularly like, let's say, like migration or refugee settlements policy has, for the 20th century at least, often focused on like more of an assimilation. How do you build new stories, and rather than like bring the old ones with us? And I was having a conversation last week actually with a Nigerian academic who has done lots of work on young migrants and what it takes to support them to settle well and thrive later on in life. And her kind of resounding conclusion to her PhD was it is both about finding ways for them to connect to the kind of the source of their heritage, perhaps that's through food, culture, religion, stories, but also then and have dedicated space and attention for that, but then also find ways for them to engage in like the generation of new stories and the generation of new identity. It has to be both. It can't just be one, Karen. And as it sounds like from the little bit we heard, you can't have one without the other, because I think that's where we can see a lot of like intergenerational trauma, I think, where there are ruptures and traumas in the past that then get passed on, because either in the things that we tell each other and the way those stories harm us, or in like deeper tissue damage than that. We know increasingly that trauma can be handed down in the womb, and it without kind of the utterance of any words or any stories passing our lips. So yeah,
as you were talking, it reminded me too, when I was 20, my friend who had known me for the longest time, like she had stories that I didn't remember about myself from when I was in kindergarten. She died of cancer, and that was so hard for me. Like I felt like a piece of me had just been ripped out, because I was like, other than my siblings who aren't as close to me as she was, nobody else has known me longer. So yeah, that going through that, almost feeling like I lost a piece of myself when I lost somebody that knew things from my life. So and then I've moved a lot around since then as well. Since getting married, I've lived, I think, 5 different places. So it's, yeah, I get a sense of that unrootedness too. Like there is a challenge in getting roots back and feeling that sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm so sorry. What a time to lose someone that you had so much ahead of you, both in terms of your relationship and her life. So yeah, I'm really sorry.
Thanks. Yeah. And is it ever easy with loss? But yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it's not.
Yeah.
No, it's not. Oh yeah, the other area. The other area of the things that I think about a lot is how we find ways to meaningfully process and come to terms with loss. And that might be loss of life, loss of community, loss of a certain standard of living that might once have been possible, loss of landscapes to climate change. There's so that we live in a time of great loss, and yet we have, in my experience, in my my cultural context, so few of the tools designed to help us cope and manage and create meaning out of that loss. So yeah, how we interested in what your experience of that is, and whether or not you felt fully able to move through that, or whether it's something that's taken you much longer to be able to talk about or attribute meaning to.
Yeah, for the death of my friend in particular, that was the first actual death human death I had dealt with. Like my childhood pet that I'd grown up with had died a few years before then, and so I had experienced some sense of loss, but not the same. And it was during college, and a bunch of my friends that I had known for a while, we all split off from each other. Whether it was because in the last year, the only thing that was holding us together was the fact that we're going to the hospital to visit her, or what, like, would it have fallen apart anyway, just because we were all in college. But yeah, like these friends that I had known for a long time, we all split apart. And it took a while. I would say I didn't even realize until after, I think all 4 of my grandparents had died by the point in time where I fully realized that I had been holding grief in my body for a long time. Like I'd grieved my friend's death multiple times, but when she died, it was also right around the holidays. So it's Christmas time and everybody's happy. And so I pushed a bunch down. And so it took me years to finally realize that I'd held all this stuff in my body, and on top of like my grandparents, learning on my 10-minute break at work that in a text from my dad that my grandpa had died, things like that, where I just learned to start pushing it down so I could get on through the day. But yeah, all then one day it all of a sudden just came out, like laughter turned to tears, and I knew that it was grief that had been held in my body that had been not expressed. But yeah, it's
those that's such a common story, isn't it? It's certainly my story, I think. And yeah, I think it's funny, isn't it? Like we sort of probably as a result of our relationship with our own mortality, I've still not got comfortable with it. I don't want to die, but I know it's happening. But as a result, it means that we think that the most important sort of loss is the loss of life, and that's sort of the thing that we want to ignore the most. But then also it sometimes, that bit of us, that fear in all of us, I think, can then get tapped into by losses of other kinds, can't they? So I think a lot about the work that I do to support charities and nonprofits to think about better endings throughout the life cycle of a whole organization. Often some of the work that I do with organizations to support them to come to a decision and then sort of then go ahead with a kind of transition and ending and then a new beginning often actually involves a lot of sorting through that like everyone's own historical experience of loss, whether it's loss of life, loss of anything, loss of relationships and relationship ending. And I was chatting over dinner last week with a friend of mine who lived in Myanmar, and he had lived there for about 6 years, and he and his wife and young family had to leave very, very quickly. He stayed for about 6 months after the kind of political disturbances of a few years ago, and when he finally left, he found himself in pieces, and he was really, really, really bereft. And having lived in this country and built a business there, and he'd lost it all. But it was only once he started peeling back the like layers of the onion that he realized, like you, he hadn't properly ever processed the trauma and the grief of his dad dying when he was 17. And so it was, you know, what seemed to be to him quite disconnected things that actually were all part of the same sort of seam that ran through him that he had to, you know, come to terms with. And I'm really interested in what it would take for us not to, in a sort of morbid way, think about endings the whole time, but what happens if we were just constantly asking ourselves in a very healthy way, not just what do we need to grow, what new relationships or new organizations or businesses or ideas need to grow in the world, but also what are the ideas or businesses or organizations or relationships that should die, that should be hospiced, and what are the ways in which we can create in each of us some resilience and some ability to do that work. Because if I think about, for me, where I see the greatest work needed in the world, it is about leaving behind like exploitative, damaging, traumatic, harmful patterns of behavior and ways of operating. It's about leaving those behind and finding new things, new ways of doing things. But we can only do that if we're able, in my opinion, to bring things to an end in a way that like recognizes that there are people, often in the charity sector in the UK, there are people doing what they see to be the best and most important work against the odds for really long periods of time. These people that don't sleep, they work 7 days a week, they've been at it for 30 years, and helping them see that something needs to come to an end because it's no longer viable, or it no longer serves its purpose, is deeply emotional work. And you can't walk in there and say, oh, come on, this thing just needs to go. You have to do it with care and honor the contribution they've made and the work they've done, but helps them come to recognize that it's time to let go. And we all need to do, I think, a bit more of that in daily life. Like I think a lot we could stand to benefit a lot by asking ourselves more, like, what should I be letting go of right now? What should I be like recognizing loss around, so that we can create the space for the new stuff, the new energy, the new ideas, the new power that needs to come through.
Yeah, I really like that idea of regularly asking, because those are important questions to ask ourselves, of like not only looking toward where can I grow, but where can I let a part of myself die because, or like let it go because it has died, and I've been holding on to it. So I love the idea of asking that every day, like getting in the habit of that.
Yeah, and it's not just about asking ourselves questions. If we think about I think if in organizational terms, we've created entire industries, global industries to start things. If you've got a new idea, you know this, right? If you've got a new idea, there are accelerator programs to join, there are books to read, there are leadership schemes to join, there are funding rounds to like apply to. And then it comes to the end of that life cycle, which if you're like me and you believe that like, well, most things are going to have their time at some point, like, and you start saying, okay, well, what's here to help this thing die? Either it's my leadership period, this fund, this organization to die. Like, everyone's left the building at that point, honestly. Like when an organization comes to me and says we want to close, and then I pick up the phone to their funders and they're like, so this organization is closed, they're like going to close, they're like, okay, have fun. And it's like, like, you help this thing come into the world, you should help it go out of the world in a way that then creates the conditions for what comes next to be right. And so I'm sort of it's partly about asking ourselves questions. It's also partly about saying, well, we have created whole systems for growth, like whole like sectors, industries to grow things. Like, what does it look like not to then have sectors that just kill things, but help things come to the end, and the knowledge that will just feed round again, and the next ideas will, the best things will bubble up, and the next and emerge. But we need to kind of create these new systems where like regenerative practice and loss is stewarded in a much more just sort of obvious day-to-day kind of like, oh yeah, that's fine, that like, you know, we know how to do this kind of way.
Yeah, living over in America where many systems are kept going beyond where they should have been left to die. I'm like, yes, please, more regenerative systems, please.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if we have Karan, if she has any questions, because I could keep talking for hours. Like you said, we could go on for hours.
I'm still here.
Okay. Do you have any more questions, Karan?
I don't. This has been just like you said. I think we could carry on this conversation for hours if I'm even still connected. But yeah, no, I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah. So much to talk about and learn, and So
thank you so much.
Yeah, I was wondering, is there anything you want to add that we haven't talked about yet?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I had one final question which we can have offline, but I'm interested in that final comment you had about things that you are like you need to like that need to die, and I'm just interested in whether this side of COVID you're seeing more of an openness to that, because I had this phenomenal conversation thinking about actually the your love of this podcast, because it connects you to people around the world, and you know, otherwise Zoom is not that much fun anymore, but this is what it's good for. I had this incredible conversation with three women in India who found me on the internet and said, let's have a chat. And I was like, yeah, let's have a chat. And they said, we lost a load of people in COVID, and we've woken up the other side of lockdowns and look around us, and we see like so much in our community and on the systems that we operate in has to die. And like they are now in the process of basically building a like mini rebellion in their corner of India for like that kind of that transitional ending stuff that you're talking about. And I was really struck how for them, although they're now focused on obviously not loss of life, it was that experience for them that provided this kind of the gateway to them being able to see the potential and possibility for wider loss and endings. And I wonder if that's something you notice, like, do people are people even in big or small ways where you are thinking more or talking more about like loss and endings, or do you still see it as kind of a taboo, the thing that people want to, you know, talk about at last resort and avoid at all costs?
I want to say there's, maybe it's just within the circle, because also Karan and we have had somebody on that was a death doula. So like, I'm all like, let's just acknowledge at some point in time, life will end, and part of pirate living is like enjoying your life now. But I'd also say, there's been more talk where I've heard from people too, like there's loss of, back to the loneliness part too, there were loss of friendships. There were gains of other types of friendships, maybe on a deeper level, but there were losses of friendships during COVID and like after, and losses of for some people, especially out here in Portland. I've heard from people where a lot of people polarized during COVID very strongly in both directions. Like, this is very serious. Like, a lot of people are dying, and other people being like, this isn't very serious. And in Portland, it's more of a side of I'm trying to like a democratic type side, what liberal side points of view, but there were people like pockets within of different points in the world where they were just disagreeing. Like I feel like people just wanted to disagree with each other. And where was I going with that? Loss. Oh yeah. So even for some people, like they lost their family members because they chose to be so polar opposites of each other instead of being able to come together and have conversations and talk. So I think there's repair going on now. More people are willing to talk of the different types of loss, but that could also just be because that's what I brought in to like the people, my site, my circle around me is being more willing to talk about those things because they are real, and I don't want to bury it down and pretend like it's not going to happen or it doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Karan, what about you? Maybe. I don't think. Oh, I was checking to see if I heard. Okay, well, I don't think
It's been really nice to chat with you both.
You
Thank
too. Before we end, two things. First, where can our listeners go to say hi to you or find out more about what you're doing?
So a couple of places. One, my website, which maybe we can share in the notes, but it's
we will.
ionaconsultancy.com. I'm also on the cusp of a really, I think, a huge privilege. Basically, I have 2 months of kind of research fellowship money, so I'm not paid working for the next 2 months, and I'm going on a big train journey around Europe, visiting people who are building bridges or connecting people across generations. So from like mountain towns in rural Sicily where the average age is 85, all the way through to big cities like Vienna where gentrification has pushed people around a bit. I'm spending the next 2 months just spending time with and learning from people who are building those bridges and understanding what it takes to get people together across those sort of perceived lines of generational difference. And I'll be blogging and tweeting and Instagramming, so maybe I can share those with you in case any of that is interesting. Also, I would love to hear from anyone, if there is anyone who has experience of or works in intergenerational work. I'm also having chats with people as I go, so if that's any of you amazing people and I can persuade you onto a Zoom call for as little as half an hour, I would love to hear about your experience and expertise.
And then final question for you is, how would you recommend our listeners start their own pirate life? So what's a step or a tip that they could take?
So I think I'm probably not going to say anything that we haven't already covered, but I suppose thinking about those two things that the rebellions that I'm involved in. So the kind of radical relationships one is like, what's the conversation that you haven't had? It might be with a complete stranger on the bus. It might be the conversation with your sister who you haven't felt connected to through COVID. It might be with the colleague who in some way intrigues you, but like you haven't found the excuse. Or it might be the person in the climbing gym. I genuinely believe, and it feels very true to the kind of pirate philosophy, that we are stronger when we take steps towards each other, and that all starts with relationships. So like, number one, what's the conversation you haven't yet had? Have it. And number two is what are you still holding on to that doesn't serve you or doesn't serve the work you want to do or the impact you want to have or the vision you have for the world? And asking yourself what would it take for you to let that go, and what would it look like for you to create the space for the thing that you think will better serve you or the purpose that you have in the world? Because I think that's a deeply radical thing to do in a time of just like unremitting growth.
Love it. Beautiful advice. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. It's been so nice to talk to you.